Well, it's really wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation, Ed, to speak about this. And I was asked to speak particularly about how a values-based approach to leadership has influenced our work at the Trussell Trust. And so I'll chat through some practical examples of that, but also just take you on a little bit of a journey through the work we've done over the last 5 years around this. Just before I start on that, though, I thought I might give a little bit of an introduction to the Trussell Trust, because some of you might not know that much about who we are or how we work. We support a network of 1,400 food bank centres across the UK. So we're based in each of the 4 nations, and working with about 57,000 referral agencies. Many will be frontline health practitioners, GPs, etc., who would come across somebody in the course of their work who's unable to afford to buy food, and they would make a referral to one of the food banks in our network. And our food banks would provide 3 days of emergency food to cover meals for everyone in the household. They'd also provide wraparound support and ongoing signposting, often other services embedded within the food bank, and I'll speak about that a little bit more in a moment. And in our work, we capture information about why it is that somebody's been referred, and we use that information to stand alongside people and to advocate for change. And I thought I'd just share a little bit of the data we've captured and what our research has found, just to give you a context for our discussion when we're talking about hunger in the UK. We released a report, in fact, entitled Hunger in the UK in the summer. And it was the largest piece of research of its type that we've done, and looking at the long-term drivers of food insecurity. And it was quite alarming. We've been doing research of this type for some time, but I think the scale of the needs that we're seeing at the moment is deeply worrisome. So we found that 1 in 7 people in the UK faced hunger in the last year because they didn't have enough money to buy food. So that equates to about 14% of the population, about 11.3 million people. That's huge numbers of people who are finding themselves without enough money to buy food. It also revealed, and I think for many of us in this room, this will not come as a surprise, that there are certain groups of people who are disproportionately overrepresented in experiencing food insecurity and often having to come to food banks. Disabled people, for example, 3/4 or 75% of people referred to food banks in our network come from a household where at least one member of the household has a disability, which is far higher than the 26% of the UK adult population who are disabled. We also see an overrepresentation of families with children. Nearly half, or 47% of all households experiencing hunger include children under the age of 16, whereas only 29% of UK households include children under the age of 16. Single parents, significantly overrepresented, making up just 3% of the population, but 11% of people facing hunger in the UK. And people from an ethnic minority background, 1 in 4, or 24% of people from an ethnic minority background face hunger, almost twice the rate, which stands at 13% for white people in the UK. So significant overrepresentation of certain groups of people, significant numbers of people in the UK experiencing hunger. And we find that there's a commonality of what people are experiencing when they arrive at our food banks. Over 86% of people who arrive at food bank are experiencing destitution, so a level of poverty that is at such a level that there are certain essentials that they are simply unable to afford. One of the definitions of destitution are being unable to afford 2 or more of the essentials we need to have shelter, food, heating, lighting, essential clothing, or basic toiletries. And over 86% of people who come to food banks meet those criteria, or not having enough money to be able to afford to buy those things. And I think that's an important framing for our discussion today. Certainly from our perspective, people who are experiencing hunger are not only experiencing hunger. If you are unable to afford food, as I said just a moment ago, you're likely unable to afford other core essentials that we all need to be able to survive. And so when we talk about the issue of food bank use, we very much frame that as being about insufficiency of income to afford the essentials. And need is growing we've just released our mid-year stats today for the first 6 months of this year. And we provided 1.5 million emergency food parcels just in the past 6 months. Last year, we provided almost 3 million parcels. And what's important to note is that this 6-month period of data I'm talking about is between April and September, so not over the winter, which is when we see much higher numbers of people coming to food banks. So we would anticipate this year there being much higher levels of need than even in the previous year. Over this last 6 months, 65% of our parcels were for families with children, and 320,000 people came to one of our food banks for the first time. So growing numbers of people are finding themselves experiencing destitution and having to come to our food banks. So back to our topic in hand, when we think about values and the role that that plays in leading an organisation like the Trussell Trust and supporting the food banks in our network. The aspiration, our shared purpose as a network was to be an anti-poverty charity that recognised that a food parcel isn't going to put money on the meter to heat your home, is not buying children's school shoes when they need them, is not dealing with the underlying issue, which is people not having enough money. So we set our shared vision together, which was a UK without the need for food banks, with that focus on tackling the need, so as we could put ourselves out of business. So with our shared purpose, we then looked at our values. And as I say, if you speak to anyone in a food bank network, what motivates them, they'll say first and foremost compassion. But there were other values at play in the work as you looked. People talking about justice, people talking about dignity, people talking about community. And so we spent considerable time reflecting on these values, not just on those singular values, but actually the interplay and the tensions created by those values together. And I think it's in that space, on that knife edge between where those values intersect, that we spend most of our time, because there are tensions. And I thought I'd just unpack a little bit of those tensions. Let's take compassion to start with. Compassionately, we could just keep providing emergency food. But at what point does that become corrosive or potentially become colluding with the systems that are driving people to be dependent on emergency food aid? We could just grow and not speak out about what's driving that need, but just continue to compassionately respond. We could build, as Ed mentioned earlier, dependency on the need for our services without ever questioning what it was that was driving that need. And so if we're only motivated by compassion and just wanting to get food to everybody, the way in which we provide that food might also not be considered. We might not be thinking about people's dignity and how we support them. We're just focused on this. So compassion, although absolutely foundational to our work, standing by itself, not in tension to other values, had the potential to become corrosive. So how does that sit alongside dignity, which is our next value? Again, if dignity alone is your only motivating factor, then you would change potentially the way you provide emergency food aid. At the moment, people are referred to our system. You could say emergency food is available. This food is available for anyone. You can self-select. You can come and access that support. And there is real dignity in that model. But we wouldn't have the data to advocate for just outcomes. We might not have the ability to defend what is going on, because you would have criticism coming in that, is there really a need here? Or is there just a choice that people are making to access food in this particular way? And we have to balance dignity alongside justice. How do we provide the most dignified experience for an individual, whilst absolutely stating it is deeply undignified that anyone have to access emergency food to get by? How do we hold that tension of providing a dignified experience for a person in an undignified system? And how does that interplay with our other value of justice, where we have to gather the evidence, the information, to be able to say this is not right, this is affecting this number of people, and this must change? And I think justice, particularly as it interplays both with dignity but with compassion, is a really interesting one. I'm often challenged about, are we not colluding effectively with government and enabling this situation to go on? Because you're always going to step in. Food banks are just always going to step in, and as increased need comes about year after year, are you not just effectively becoming an extension of the state and allowing others not to take responsibility? Why don't you just shut down and then government would have to step in? And that's a valid question that we have to ask ourselves. At what point are we excusing others from taking responsibility? But that's where there's almost like this infinity loop between justice and compassion. If somebody's coming to you and they don't have enough money to afford food, you want to respond compassionately. You have to respond. That's what we do for our neighbours. We step in. But we have to point to the fact that it's not right. We need to point to long-lasting solutions that are better and more dignified and more appropriate than food. So you keep that justice and compassion in tension, and you loop through the two. Justice without compassion is harsh and brutal and doesn't protect the person today in front of you. But compassion without justice becomes collusion, potentially, if you're not signposting what needs to change. So we hold those values in tension. And then finally, our last value is community. Again, there would be more efficient ways of providing emergency food aid on the scale that we're providing it than through community centres with volunteers that provide this welcoming environment. I go into food banks, and you see in little church halls, tables set out with beautiful tablecloths and flowers, and egg and bacon sandwiches available, and cakes. And I talk about this radical welcome you experience when you walk through the door of a food bank. And they don't know who I am when I walk in. And so I get this radical welcome because people know how hard it is to step over the doorstep of a food bank and ask for help. And so I'm just embraced. That's how we deliver support in communities. Now, more efficiently, if I wanted to get maximum food out to people on scale, I could have a big warehouse, I could have door-to-door click and collect services. You could do it much more efficiently. But that would be totally undermining the value of the offer of community. We know from our Hunger in the UK research that a quarter of people who are coming to us have had no contact with anyone in the previous month. Quarter. Social isolation is a terrible problem. You think about, somebody mentioned earlier, I think Martin, you, about like food being about more than just surviving. One of the indicators of food insecurity that is used is whether somebody has the ability to offer hospitality. And that stays with me a lot. If you can't offer hospitality, you are less likely to accept hospitality from someone else. And that embarrassment and that stigma that comes from not having enough money to offer hospitality is then compounded because you can't accept hospitality from others. Social isolation is a brutal outcome of not having enough money to be able to afford the essentials. So community is so, so important. That safe space, that warm welcome, that radical welcome, to be part of a community of solidarity, people standing alongside you whilst providing emergency food. So that value also drives how we work, not just what we do, but how we provide that support. And so our values framework sits straddled over those four values with our purpose clear. We want to end the need for emergency food aid, end the need for mass distribution of emergency food in the 5th richest country in the world. But how we do that is almost more important than what we do. And that is determined by the interplay of those four values. I just wanted to end by just giving some examples of decisions we've had to make where those values have stood us in incredibly good stead. First is in the early days of the pandemic. So our model is dependent on people picking up items at a supermarket, donating them, local volunteers picking them up, and providing them to people who have been referred to us by local referral agencies. Overnight, food disappeared off of supermarket shelves. Referral agencies closed down and couldn't pass people to us. And the number of people coming to food banks doubled overnight. Within a 2-week period, we had an 89% increase in the number of people coming through the door. As people lost part-time work, self-employed, just overnight, we saw that increase. The government, as you can imagine at that time, was deeply concerned about what was going on. I was worried about where we were going to get food from, but you'd see that we would have no food, and all of these people were coming to us. And so an offer was made to us from government that they could give us money to purchase food. You know, they were keen to do that. So we look back at our values. So that would allow us to provide a compassionate response. Definitely, we'd be able to have bought food potentially and provide that. It's probably going to be difficult from a community point of view, because how could we buy that food and get it to people? But we could work that through. But would it be just if what we were saying is the reason people are having to come to food bank is because they don't have enough money, and the government have the capacity to get money to people? Should we be taking that money to turn it into food to give to people who needed money? And so by saying no to that money, but then working really closely with government to understand how we could set up a household support fund, looking at the £20 uplift to universal credit, understanding how to suspend deductions from universal credit to allow people to hold on to more of their money, those are just solutions that were more appropriate, even though operationally we had some challenges that we had to overcome during that. And there was points where I was on my knees making that decision, very difficult decision, but our values framework gave us a language for discussion as an organisation and with our food banks to make a decision on what was the right thing to do in that situation. We know that the second example would be, we know that if we can maximise people's incomes by helping them navigate social security or additional support, we can maximise their income, they're less likely to have to come to a food bank. That is a good outcome, but it's very difficult sometimes if you have a disabled child or additional support needs to navigate social security and get your entitlement. So we wanted to put advice at the front line. But we're an organisation that wants to go out of business. So do you build up your own advice services at that point? Or do you use the funds that we had available to work alongside other organisations who were doing that work already? And so we made a decision that we wanted there to be financial inclusion services in our food banks available for people who are experiencing destitution. But what we did is we funded our food banks to commission those services from local provision that was already there. And so the structure of our organisation was rooted in those values of and our purpose of wanting to put ourselves out of business, but recognising that this is a service that would have to live on beyond the mass distribution of food aid. So it shaped our service delivery as well. And then the final area I just want to touch on is around advocacy. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about this after the break as well. So I'll just share a little bit from our perspective. But how those values inform how we work with our food banks, how our food banks work in their communities is one element. But also those values permeate our relationships with people in power and with policymakers as well. How do we uphold the dignity of decision makers and policymakers who we're seeking to influence? As we go into those conversations, how do we show compassion as we disagree on what some of those outcomes need to be and changes need to be? How do we seek to build consensus or community with people in power, people who we may fundamentally disagree with on so many different things? How do we find those points of consensus and build from those places? And how do we find just solutions where we speak truth to power, but we do it in a way that upholds dignity, builds consensus, builds community, and is compassionate, recognising that different people are trying different ways, but are often coming from a similar position of wanting to resolve a situation. So that's really affected our advocacy work significantly. We often, people who we're working with who have direct experience of having to access our services, and even me myself, would have grounds for being really angry. But that doesn't uphold dignity often. Also, often is a barrier to building consensus. And if your most important thing is to find a just outcome, and those are obstacles to reaching that, you have to regulate that and find other ways of having those conversations. And we have found that the best way to go about delivering effective advocacy is to work alongside and with people with direct experience of having to access after tax, direct experience of poverty. How do we create spaces where people who hold power, policymakers, decision makers, can build relationships with people who have to access many of those services, and that from those relationships they can design and deliver change that will be effective? How do we step back and amplify the voices of people and the experiences of people and the ideas of people who know exactly what needs to change because they've had direct experience of accessing the services? And that's radically changed the way we approach advocacy. There is a role for learned expertise, definitely, but it's a partnership with lived expertise. And without those two coming together, and with that, I think, mutual respect that you had talked about, Ed, and going into discussions with decision makers from a position of mutual respect, we can't get the change that we need. And so those values that affect not only how we deliver services and engage with people who are accessing our services also form the way we work in partnership and work with those who we're seeking to influence. And that's been really transformational for us. And the last point I would probably make is that what I've really learned over this last 5 years, and I've said this before actually, it's not what we do, it's how we do it that will build the kind of society where nobody needs a food bank because nobody will allow it. We can't build consensus across the general public, for example, for those outcomes that we want to see. We're always going to be at the whim of a change in policy or decision making. And so these values are not just about how we lead our work or lead our organisation, but how we model how society could and should be in order to create conditions where nobody is going hungry and nobody is needing to access